Good morning, and it is Bible study time at Calvary Baptist Church. We're in our Sunday school hour on Sunday morning, and if you don't have a church home or if you've not been attending, let me remind you that Bible study supposed to start at 9:15. We usually are a little later when we start a video, but anyway, you're welcome to come. We have all ages, and we'll do our best to talk about the Bible and teach you some things, hopefully, that will be relevant to your life. So that's where we are. And just want to invite you to come to do that. We started a new unit the 1st of June, and it's a unit entitled Mentoring, Investing in Others. That's really what life should be about, isn't it? Is investing in others. I think about all the people who have mentored me and who have invested in me. And I never really had one person who just took me aside and said, watch what I do, then you're going to model it, and then you're going to be doing it and teaching someone else, because that's the process, isn't it? But I had lots of people along the way who took enough interest in me that let me watch them, and then some pushed me to do. And so through the process, it's I'm indebted to a lot of people, and a lot of them are people who were in this church. I came here as a young man, much younger than now, and people were just very helpful and encouraging and patient with me, and so I appreciate that. And a lot of them have gone on to be with the Lord, and so good. Praise the Lord for that. Well, we started out talking about Jethro and Moses in the Old Testament, and then we went to Moses and his appointment, or his setting aside Joshua to be the leader when they entered into the promised land after they had wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. And today, then, we come to another great story of mentorship. And it's a reminder to us that not all mentors are perfect. Not all mentors are flawless. Some, though, recognize their need. And if you are willing to learn, if you are willing to listen, and absorb what they can give you, they can teach you lots of things. Some of the people that have taught me things through the years weren't always people I liked. It's just part of it. But they were people that I saw things in them that were valuable. And I felt like that's something I should take with me, and that's something I should get. And so a mentor doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to be a perfect person to be a mentor. And we're certainly going to see that in this couple of people today: Eli, the high priest, and Samuel, his understudy. And just we have reminders as we begin. Eli had a life that played out like a soap opera. He was high priest at Shiloh. Shiloh was the place where the tent of meeting was, and that's where the Ark of the Covenant was, and that's where the people would go to worship. This was long before David then set everything in Jerusalem. Shiloh is about 35 miles north of Jerusalem. And so that was kind of the center. That was kind of the place where people went to worship. And so the high priest was there, and Eli, and he had two sons, and his sons were not really good guys. They were pretty bad guys. He had not done a good job of mentoring them, and they certainly weren't good students. They were good students of evil and corruption, I would say. And so the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, starts with the story of a woman named Hannah. And Hannah, of course, the word Hannah in Hebrew means grace. And so Hannah, she was married to a man named Elkanah, but she had been able to bear him children. Elkanah also had another wife. Her name was Peninnah, or you might say it Peninnah. I've heard it pronounced both ways. Anyway, she had been able to produce lots of children, and sometimes she would kind of judge that over Hannah. And so it was really hard. And for a Hebrew woman, that's one of the big things that produces, or that's one of the things that makes you valuable, is if you're producing children. And so her womb was barren. She wasn't able to produce children, and she was very broken about it. And so one day, Elkanah, Hannah, and Peninnah went to Shiloh to worship. And while they were there, Hannah prayed that God would somehow give her a child. And so in the process then, When she went back a year later, she was pregnant, and Eli, the high priest, thought she was, well, when she was praying, she was so broken, but Eli thought she was crazy, or thought she was drunk, or thought something was weird with her. But she was just so broken about it. And he said, let God do what you've asked him to do. Well, he did. And so then she took Samuel, the son that God had given her. And by the way, she went on to have more sons and a couple of daughters, because the Lord opened up her womb. But Hannah then took Samuel and said, because God has given him to me, I'm going to give him back to God. So when he was 3 or 4, about the time he was weaned, potty trained, all those things, well, then she took him back to the temple where Eli, the high priest, mentored him. And can you imagine? Yeah, I'm here at the church, and I can imagine somebody bringing me their child and saying, I want you to raise this child for me. Oh, how could I get anything done? Well, anyway, but Samuel was a good student, and Eli became a good mentor to him. But he had these 2 bad sons, and they were bad guys. Well, one of the things that Hannah had promised the Lord was that she would dedicate him to a Nazarite vow, which meant didn't shave his head, he wouldn't drink alcohol, and he wouldn't have any contact with corpses, those things that really desecrate a person. And so she had Samuel, I guess 3 other sons and 2 daughters. So she had 6 children in all. So then we pick up the story in chapter 2 when we get to the mentorship of Eli and Samuel. And that's where I want to begin. And just as a reminder, the point of this section is that not everyone listens to wise counsel. That is true, isn't it? Not everyone listens very well. So we begin in verse 22 of chapter 2 of 1 Samuel. It says, now Eli was very old. He heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel and how they were sleeping with the women who served at the entrance of the tent of meeting. He said to them, why are you doing these things? I have heard about your evil actions from all these people. No, my sons, the news I hear from the Lord's people spreading is not good. I hear the Lord's people spreading is not good. If one person sins against another, God can intercede for him. But if a person sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him? But they would not listen to their father, since the Lord intended to kill them. By contrast, the boy Samuel grew in stature and in favor with the Lord and with people. So here you have in the tent of meeting, which was the tabernacle. And of course, they had built something inside of there that was kind of a little more structural or permanent. But here they were, and so the Ark of the Covenant was there. All the things that God had commanded Moses to put there were there, and it was a place where people came to worship, to make sacrifice, to do the things that God had instructed the people to do. And by contrast, you have the sons of Eli who were crooked, corrupt. It talks about some of the things that they were doing. Another place that says that they were gluttons, that when people would bring sacrifices, instead of offering it to God, they just ate it. They just, ate it for themselves. They were not good guys. Plus, then it says they were literally they were sleeping with some of the women who hung around there. The worship of Yahweh God has never, ever been associated with any kind of sexual sacrifice or any kind of sexual anything. That's the pagans. That's the idols. That's the idolatry of the world. That's the man-made religions do that kind of thing. The worship of Yahweh has never been associated with that, except for here. And maybe some other places where people were evil and corrupt, but far from it. That should never be it. Yahweh does not want you to do things with people or do things that are immoral or illicit or whatever. That's not what he calls you to do. He calls you to be consecrated to him. He calls you to be sacrificing yourself, as Paul said in Romans, as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God. And so here they were there, and they weren't even quiet about it. And here's a funny, interesting thing: Eli's sons had Egyptian names. That's what's kind of interesting about this. So not only were they uh, priests, well, they were priests because they were Eli's sons, and we know when they came out of Egypt, and God set apart the tribe of Levi, which was Moses and Aaron, set aside the tribe of Levi to be Levites, to be a tribe of priests. And so here they were, and because they had Egyptian names, it makes you wonder who was Eli's wife, or what was in his background, or where were these guys? And that in itself should have probably even been a violation of their being fit to serve as priests in the tent of meeting, or the place where they were worshiping. So Hophni was one of the boys. Hophni means tadpole. Yeah, I don't know why. Phineas was the other boy, and that means dark skinned. So one was a tadpole and one was dark skinned, and they were skunks, is really what they were. They did not at all represent or in any way, shape, or form um, resemble what worship to Yahweh God should have been like. So it says in 1 Samuel 2:12 that they were the sons of Eli, the sons of wickedness. They were sons of Belial. They were sons of evil. They were sons of destruction. And so, in the construction of that terminology, it even says that Eli was associated with the same thing. So here we have a guy who maybe his boys weren't totally on their own there. Maybe Eli himself had not really taught them and trained them well. Maybe someone even before him had not trained and taught him well. We don't know. We do know that we are just about to leave the period of Judges in Old Testament history, and we know that there was a time when it says when God began to appoint judges, that there was a time when in Israel every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so therefore sin abounded. We at least have some kind of reformation happening, some kind of restoration starting to take place, because they're beginning to set that right and set that straight. So the judges at least began to draw the people back to a place where they could recognize the ways of God and do better than they had for a while. So here's Eli. Then it says in verse 22 that he wasn't just old; he was very old. Okay, and you might look at that and read, okay, he was very old. What does that mean? Well, it means he was very old. And if the Hebrew hadn't put the word "very" in there, he could have just been old. But he's literally saying he is old, old, old. He was old. That means his sons were not young either, right? And they've been doing this in Israel a long time. And so Eli tells the boys, look, I've heard what you were doing. The people are talking about it. You guys, I wrote on the side here, a margin here, you guys are yucky. That's just what you are. You are doing yucky things. Sacred prostitution is never a practice and should have never, ever been associated with the worship of the true God, the creator of the universe. Never. And so it's despicable, isn't it? It's just downright despicable. And we know in the New Testament that Paul strongly said that we were to flee from sexual immorality, that we were to do whatever. Well, what does we were to not do whatever, rather, I'm saying. We know that Eli said to the boys, he said, look, you're in dangerous territory here. If you sin against man, then maybe you've got an advocate. Maybe you got someone who will stand for you and at least, give you a little grace. But if you sin against God, he's the ultimate judge. You have no grace. You are judged already, and you're guilty. And because what they were doing, these evil acts, these shameful acts, these scandalous things that were happening, and you know how people love to talk. And I said earlier that Eli's life was kind of like a soap opera. Well, let me tell you, folks, I don't I don't know why anybody would follow what celebrity people do. You know, I saw something where, oh, there's going to be a new season of the Kardashians. And I said, who cares? Who cares about these people? You know, do they have to feed their own egos? Is that all they've got to offer? Is their drama? You know, they're duds as far as I'm concerned. Well, anyway, moving on. So, um, so Eli said the news is not good, folks, and you're in big trouble. Something bad is going to happen, you know. And here's the thing: if your father knows, God knows. I mean, that's the way it is. God already knows, and so they're in big, big trouble. Well, let's move on. So then we jump to 1 Samuel chapter 3, and chapter 2 kind of ends with God telling Eli how he's going to bring judgment down on him, how this is not going to go well. And, you know, if you've read much of the Old Testament at all, you know, once God gets fed up, it doesn't go well for anybody. You know, he pretty much lets you know he's still in charge. And so that's the way he kind of spells it out, that that's what's going to happen. Matter of fact, he says to Eli, look, you are descendants of Zadok. No, not Zadok. You are descendants of what priest? Zadok was the one who kind of came in the next line, but Eli's line would never be priests again because of the action of Eli. He was guilty because he hadn't taught his boys, he hadn't called them and reined them in, and also because of the sins of the boys, that their line would not be priests anymore, that they were going to be cut off. That's pretty big news, isn't it? That's pretty hard news. But then we know that Zadok, when David became king, that Zadok out of the tribe of Aaron was a good priest. He was a good high priest, and so out of that line, then that continued on for several generations out of the tribe of Zadok. So, well, let's move on now. 1 Samuel chapter 3, then we get over into, here's this boy Samuel there, and Eli is mentoring him, and Samuel is growing. And so that's a good thing, because if you have any remembrance of Hebrew history, you know, we had the period of Judges, and they started some reformation. At least they revealed to the people their sin. And then Samuel is really this unique character. He was trained as a priest, but he wasn't really a priest. He was also a judge in some ways, but he wasn't really a judge. But he was like this go-between, or this bridge between the judges and the prophets, because he was really the first, what we would call true God-called prophet, at least of what we have our history in the scriptures as. So, so a unique individual. You know, he had so many things going for him there in his life. So no wonder God called him out. And by the way, you know, his mother asked for him and she got him. And aren't you glad? Because there's so much about the Old Testament, especially beginning at this point, that changes. So many things change from this point on. And Samuel was a big part of that change. So it says, beginning of verse 7, and I don't know why we don't have those early verses, but we don't. So it says in verse 7, that Samuel did not yet know the Lord, because the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. So what is happening is Samuel and Eli go to bed. They're in this probably more permanent type structure that's under the tent, and they're in there, and they're sleeping pretty close. You know, they made their bed pretty close to the Ark of the Covenant, it says in those first verses. And so they're in there. Well, there's probably maybe a divider or something in between them. So Samuel is there. He's sleeping. His name is called. He wakes up, and he comes to Eli, and he says, here I am. You know, you called me. What do you want? Happens 3 times. Finally, on the 3rd time, Eli figures out, maybe since it's not me, and it's probably not my rotten boys, it must be the Lord who's calling you. So next time when this happens, he says to him then, there in verse 8, he says, once again, for the third time, the Lord called Samuel. He got up, went to Eli, and said, "Here I am, you called me." And then Eli understood that the Lord was calling the boy. He told Samuel, "Go and lie down. If he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. And the Lord came and stood there and called as before, "Samuel." But this time he said his name twice. "Samuel." And Samuel responded, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And that's basically what Eli told him to say, except Samuel didn't say, and if we look at the accuracy of the scripture, he didn't say, "Speak, Lord." He simply said, "Speak." And there's a lot of speculation on why he didn't acknowledge God. We've already read up here, he didn't yet know the Lord because the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that Samuel had learned a lot about the Lord because he was in the tent of meeting. He was there learning. He was being mentored. He was being taught. He was being trained. But as a prophet, he had never heard the Lord speak directly to him. And so perhaps that's why he didn't say, "Speak, Lord," because he didn't really know the voice as his Lord just yet. It was coming, wasn't it? And so, anyway, through the years, there have been a lot of people who have said to me, "I think maybe God is calling me to do something." And, I'm always willing to listen to that. I'm always willing to pray about that with that person. I'm always willing to give some encouragement or give some advice on that. But I believe until you really hear from the Lord, you can say, "I think maybe God's calling me to do that." But the correct answer is, "I believe God wants me to do this." And when you are just speculating in your own mind, or you look at a need and you say, "I could do that," but you need to really search and ask God, "Is this what you want me to do?" And do I believe God still calls people today? Absolutely. I do believe God calls people today, but I also believe there's a lot of people who come along and say, think maybe God wants me to do this. And then they try to do it. And if you try to do it in your own strength, you might be able to succeed for a while. You might be able to do a little, but Jesus said, "Without me, you can do nothing." And I believe that's true. And therefore, it is when you can say with confidence, "I believe, I know God is calling me to do whatever, fill in the blank." That is when you really have heard a word from the Lord. That's when you're confident. And what happens with that is, once you hear that, once you know that, you can't keep but do something. And we're going to see in a minute what you have to do first, what really has to happen. So to this point, I believe Samuel was depending upon Eli to hear from God because Eli was teaching him all the things about God that he could. But it shifts at this point because God becomes personal to him. Now listen, in salvation, whenever you surrender your will to God's and he becomes personal to you, that's when you will know that you know that you know that you are saved, that you are his, that you are in line to be a part of his kingdom, and that he is going to prepare a place for you for eternity in heaven. That's when you know that you know that you know, when you really do hear from God. What does that mean? Well, sometimes it's a voice. Sometimes it's the conviction of the Holy Spirit, and you just can't shake it. Sometimes God just keeps putting something in front of you, and you just can't not do it, and you have to do it. But you have to do it. And so here was Samuel, and 3 times God has called his name, and 3 times he's gone to Eli. And finally, Eli figures it out. It's the Lord who's calling you. And so you need to answer. And the 4th time, we say 3's a charm. Well, maybe it was for Eli to figure it out, but really the 4th time is when God called him. Aren't you glad God doesn't give up on us? Aren't you glad that he keeps calling, that he keeps convicting, that he keeps speaking? Sometimes that's through his word. Sometimes it's through prayer. Sometimes it's through other people around us. Sometimes it's an audible voice, or it's something that's so heavy on our hearts by the Spirit that we know what God says. But he never gives up on us. He's always patient. The call is important. When God calls you, you know it, and you're willing to say, speak, for your servant is listening. So that's what Samuel did. And then we read the next verses, verses 15 through 18. Did we jump through a little there? Yeah, we did. We jumped a few more verses. Well, that's a bummer, isn't it? So Samuel hears from God. God tells him what he wants him to know. And sometimes that's the way God comes, is he doesn't say, oh, I've been watching you, I've been doing whatever, all this kind of stuff. He goes right to Samuel and says, here's the message. And the message is, here's how it's coming down. Eli and his boys, I'm done with them. I am done with them. And so he gives them that message. Well, Samuel, it says then in verse 15, we read, Samuel lay down until the morning. Gives you the impression that he went back to sleep. Now, I don't know about you, but if God gives me a big word of judgment against the people that are authority over me in the place where I am, I don't know that I can sleep, especially when I think tomorrow, if they ask me, because Eli knows God's called him, God's been speaking to him, what am I going to say? And I can't lie to him. I mean, I really have to tell them, oh, yeah, God said, you guys are done for. It's over. Can I do that? I don't know. I don't think I can go back to sleep. But the terminology here, it literally tells you he lay back down means he went back to sleep. Why? Because it wasn't him God was after, was it? It wasn't him. He wasn't worried about it, except he was worried about telling them. I believe he was concerned about that. So he gets up and it says that he was afraid. He opened the door to the Lord's house. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision, but Eli called him and said, Samuel, my son. What does it say? Here I am. That's what he'd said in the night, wasn't it, to Eli? Here I am. And in verse 17, what was the message he gave you? Eli asked. Don't hide it from me. May God punish you and do so severely if you hide anything from me that he has told you. Whoa. Now he put it all on Eli, didn't he? He said, you're going to put yourself in the same boat here, buddy, if you don't tell me what God said. So Samuel told him everything and did not hide anything from him. And instead of Eli getting angry at Samuel and whooping him real good and saying, that couldn't have been what you heard, Eli knew. That tells you where Eli was with God. His boys, probably not. But at least Eli knew the Lord. And Eli responded, he is the Lord. Let him do what he thinks is good. I believe if God is calling you, the first thing he calls you to is commitment. And then he gives you the opportunity to be faithful. And if you are faithful, he will call you to deeper commitment. He will call you to deeper things, and he will continue to put responsibility on you, responsibility for him, responsibility for his kingdom. And he will call you to obedience, commitment, obedience. When you know that you believe he is calling you, he calls you to service. And that's what he did with Samuel. How did Samuel get in that place? At a praying mother? He owed her, in some ways, his, what you might say, his spiritual beginnings, even though he really owed it to God. But had his mother not been willing to seek and to know, where would he be? She consecrated him to the Lord. She dedicated him to the Lord's service. And that's why it's so important to dedicate children, to do the Hannah thing, to say, God, you gave me this child. It's not mine to keep. It's not mine to mother over or to hoard over or any way, shape, or form. It's mine to train the best way that I can in order that when they have the opportunity to hear from you, you will call them to commitment and they'll respond. And by the response, they'll live a life of service. That's the key. I believe that's the kind of mentors God calls us to be. And we can be good mentors, but we also need good mentees. Is that a good way to put it? You know, not to be confused with Mentos. Fresh breath. But we do need to be ready, willing, and able to learn. When people try to mentor us, when people try to train us and teach us, we need to listen if we're going to be obedient to God. So, good lesson, folks. Good lesson. If you want to know more about those boys, tadpole and dark-skinned, if you want to know a little more about those rascals, go read it for yourself. Chapter 3, chapter 4, in there, you'll read about their demise because they got it. And don't ever think that you can disobey God. You can't. Okay, bye-bye.